Okay, good evening, everyone. This is your official April Fool calling the Gig Harbor Planning Commission to order at 5:05 p.m. on April 1st, 2021. First, we'll do a quick roll call. Shannon Greina.
Present.
Bob Soltis.
Here.
Tom Brown.
Here.
Amanda Bennett.
Here.
Larry Bradbury.
Here.
John Krasick. And I am Greg Huxema. I also see from the city Kim Mahoney, Carl DeSimas, and Michelle Thomas. So welcome, everyone. And with that, I guess I gotta open up my computer that went to sleep on me. First item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which was 2 weeks ago. So are there any comments or changes? If not, I'll accept a motion to approve those minutes.
Move to approve the minutes as written.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed, say nay. Motion passes unanimously. And I am still looking for my agenda. But I know you're up, Carl.
Yeah, I think that's the only thing we've got on the agenda tonight is just this public art amendment, shoreline master program.
Correct.
All right, let me share my screen over here.
If I could interrupt for a second, I
Sure.
just saw John's box light up on my screen. John, are you there?
Yes, I am. I had to join you by phone because I'm having computer problems and I could not bring the system up.
No worries. So we can just make a note that John Krasick joined the meeting at 5:07.
Noted. Okay, thank you, Chair. I will, so tonight, we're going to be I'll be giving you a brief presentation here relative to the Shoreline Master Program Amendment, public art. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay, right now I'm showing the memo dated March 25th, 2021 that I sent out with all of the materials for your review.
Yeah. Hey, Carl, excuse me again. Everyone, if you could please mute your mics.
Okay, thanks, Chair. And so I'm not going to belabor the details too much here as far as the memo goes. I just trust that everybody had a chance to read it, and the memo was really meant to just be a quick overview and reminder again of kind of where we've been, and get a little more specific with this amendment, because as you'll recall, last time we discussed this, it was kind of an introductory discussion about this amendment, and we were also talking about the periodic update, which is forthcoming. So this was meant to get into a little more detail and kind of give you a flavor for the direction that we want to take this amendment in, and how we're going to get it there. So as noted in the memo, we have sort of now two proposals working sort of simultaneously. We have what was proposed by Public Works in their application packet, and that's what was shown to you previously at the last meeting. And since that time, staff kind of got back together, put our heads together, worked with our consultant, Reddy Associates, and taking what has already been prepared and thinking through it and put together another proposal that we're calling sort of the staff amendment. And that's really what I want to kind of focus on tonight for the most part. However, when we get into discussion, if you've got questions about the Public Works amendment, we can certainly talk about them interchangeably. We think with the staff amendment, what we were really trying to do was borrow from that proposal and improve upon it, largely based on what we heard from Planning Commission at the last meeting. So we really tried hard to look at what the feedback you had given us and weave that into this proposal from staff. And to that end, in this memo, the main reason for this memo was really to kind of go through the questions that you all had asked previously, because there was a really good discussion that we had for an introduction. I thought it was a really good discussion. It was really more like a study session, which was great. It's exactly what we needed. So you asked questions about defining art, and we listened and we added some language. We changed the definition up a bit in the staff proposal. We talked a little bit about where this should be in the Shoreline Master Program. We did create a new chapter where the regulations would live. We talked a little bit about what would be regulated. That's also covered. Should it be considered water dependent? We agreed that it probably shouldn't be, and Grady strongly agreed that it shouldn't be. We talked about looking at what other jurisdictions have done, and we were able to do that. And I'll kind of put a pin in that one. I'll come back to that one in just a moment. We talked. There was some discussion about who should be involved in sort of the decision-making process, and who's going to approve the art, and that's also covered in the staff amendment. Talked a little bit about the cultural history of Gig Harbor and tying that into art. That's covered. Consider regulating the depth of an installation when so close to ordinary high water mark, and I believe this was Commissioner Bennett, one of Commissioner Bennett's items that she had brought up, and that one's a little more difficult, and I don't think that it is covered. When we get into looking at the actual amendment, maybe we can hit on that again. But I don't believe that might be the one outlier that's not covered. Now that said, it will be covered because we're not allowing any kind of any net loss with the project, with whatever project would be proposed, but there would also be mitigation required. So in that sense, I suppose we would be covering it if it was something that needed to have great depth in order to be sited in that location. Well, then they would have to figure out how to do that and still maintain a no net loss of ecological function. So it would be covered sort of de facto, but it's not addressed directly. So I just want to say that, put that out there. And then we talked about the exemption. I'm also going to put a pin in that one really quick, and I'll come right back to that as well. And then there was a question about why art would lose its value if it were placed outside the buffer or released further from ordinary high water mark. And I think that one also gets into sort of the question of the cultural heritage of the harbor and what the actual need for the art is. Why why it's being proposed in the location it's being proposed. And I suppose that's a little bit more subjective. And again, I don't believe that one is also addressed directly. So, but getting back to the two items that I stuck a pin in there, which were, just rethink this for just a second. The first being looking at other jurisdictions. We were able to do a quick survey of a few jurisdictions. We looked at Paulsbo, Port Townsend, Bremerton. We already had an example from Olympia. And I did a quick look at Des Moines as well. And well, the list could be, well, in this region, we could go on that. We could be chasing down that rabbit hole for a long time, right? Because we've got a lot of shorelines in this neck of the woods. So we tried to just pick a few that we thought were like Gig Harbor and that potentially would have art in the area that we're discussing, which is within the critical area buffer and the vegetation conservation area or vegetation conservation strip, depending on how it's defined by that jurisdiction. And we didn't find a lot of good examples is what it came down to. There just isn't a lot out there. What we did find was Olympia, which was the first one that we received from Ecology, was our best example of what we're actually trying to achieve. That's actually here. So in Olympia, what they've done is kind of what we are trying to achieve as well. They look at this as so you have to look at this in twofold sort of. So it's defining art as a use first of all, and secondly, it's defining where we can place it. And in this case, in Gig Harbor, we want to place it on public properties, and we want to place it close to the shoreline. So within the vegetation, what we call the vegetation conservation strip. So that's what we're really trying to do. Now, Olympia does this. They've got permitted uses and activities within vegetation conservation areas. And you can see here, they say subject to other limitations of this chapter and if also allowed within the applicable shoreline environmental designation, which is exactly what we're doing. The following uses and activities are permitted within vegetation conservation areas without a variance. So going down then, you get to number 10, the following facilities, fixtures, and furnishing shall be allowed within the VCA of public parks and water-related recreation areas. Number 4, public art installations. And then they go on to say environmental interpretive facilities and information kiosks and interpretive exhibits. So very similar to what we're trying to do. Further, they go into their vegetation conservation area standards, which we've also done in the staff proposal, and define exactly how this would impact the VCA or what would be allowed to impact in the VCA. And so they give some standards here. 33% of the vegetation conservation area can be utilized for those authorized uses. And the activities described above, which is what we just went through. And then they talk about how much impervious surface can be allowed. And they say what the minimum width of the required VCA could be. So if it's a reduction, they still have to maintain 10-foot VCA. And they also talk again about the no net loss to shoreline ecological functions, which is a thread throughout every SMP that you'll read and a requirement, frankly, in state law. So this really is, looking at all that we looked at, this was the best example in supporting what it is this amendment is really trying to achieve. And there, as I said, there weren't a lot of other great examples. We did find in, let's see, where's it at? In Port Townsend, they have a really good definition in their SMP for artwork. And I'm sorry, it's cut off right here, but I can read what it says. So as used in this master program, artwork means an original creation of visual art, including but not limited to sculptures, fountains, ceramic tiles, and earthworks, murals and structures. And then it says such as the Jackson Bequest or Wave Viewing Gallery, which are specific, I suppose, specific murals or structures in Port Townsend are excluded from this definition. And it says the city sign code, see the city sign code for regulation of murals, and then see the definition of structure otherwise. So this definition that they've used here is very similar actually to the one that Public Works proposed, and it's very similar to what we came up with subsequently as well. So, and I think it's a pretty good definition. We had talked a little bit about trying to make the definition maybe less specific, I think at the last meeting. But in looking at this and also in talking with ecology and GREDI, we felt that it is actually better to be a little more specific if we can. So that's what we've proposed. And of course, that's open to discussion here tonight. So going back a little bit then, as far as looking at exemptions and the reason that we brought forward just regulations as the staff recommendation, we received this from GREDI and Associates, the biologist. And I had a phone call with him and asked him very pointedly, to kind of think about this, this idea of just making this an exemption outright. And they advised against it. And this is their rationale for it. And I think it's pretty good rationale. Their thought is that there's already some allowances within our VCS, like fire pits and little sitting areas and things like that. So passive recreation or enjoyment, and that's largely on private property, of course, but we have to sort of liken this to how the public is using public property and how the public is using their own private property. And there's some similarities there. So they feel like lumping the art together with those things that are sort of already allowed in the VCS is better rationale. It's more sound planning. It's better code writing, and probably more consistent overall with what the Shoreline Master Program and ultimately the SMA is trying to achieve. So that's why we only brought forward regulations. We went away from the exemption idea. So this was the amendment that you had looked at our last meeting. So this is the Public Works language that was proposed. I'm not going to go into it because we already sort of went over it last time. But again, when we get into the discussion, if you want to come back to this document and talk about this versus what's being proposed now, or wherever we end up, I've got it available here and I can pull it back up when we get to that point. So this is the staff recommended amendment. And so, as I said, this amendment was put together largely actually by Kim Mahoney, who's here on the call with us tonight. I think she did a really great job of pulling together this language, and it's really meant to be an amalgam of all of the work that Public Works did to put together their application package, some of the work that GREDI has done for us already, the work that you all did briefly on the introductory meeting that we had last time, and then just what staff has kind of put our heads together on, and also in our discussions with ecology. So right now, ecology is also looking at these amendments that we've put together, as well as the Public Works amendments, and they'll be providing us with some feedback as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that maybe after the discussion when we get into the schedule and next steps. But as you can see, and I again, I don't want to belabor this too much because you've all had a chance to look at it, and so there's no point in me regurgitating it to you. But I do have as I said in my memo, I have the full chapters available too that I can pull up when we get into discussion, if there's questions about how this relates to other pieces of the Shoreline Master Program or within the chapter itself. But just really quickly, so we provided a new definition for public art, much like the Public Works version of the amendments did. We added a subsection in 6.2.4 to deal with the vegetation conservation strip and making an allowance for public art within that protected area, like we do for some other amenities, such as fire pits and the like. We added, and I should say within that, the area required for installation of the public art shall be applied to the maximum 15% clearing allowed for the marine vegetation conservation strip or critical area buffer as set forth in this section of 6.2.44. And it says above, and that sort of misleading because you're not going to be able to get there when you're looking at this abbreviated version. But when we get into discussion, I can pull up the chapter and we can look at that 6.2.44 if there's questions about how that relates. But essentially, what we tried to do here was make this consistent with what we allow other appurtenances to do within the VCS. So we don't want this to be any more or less intense in the VCS or any less invasive than anything else would be allowed to be. So consistency is really what we're trying to go for. And then we added public art as a permitted use in wetland buffer areas, because as you know, along the shoreline, we end up with we have a lot of wetlands, estuarine wetlands. And so we have to account for those buffers as well. And when we're talking about wetland buffers, it should also be noted that we do allow, a lot of people think that we don't allow anything to be placed within a wetland buffer. Well, that's not necessarily true. We do allow certain things in buffers, in wetland buffers. It's just a matter of where they're located within that buffer and the category classification of the buffer. For instance, for category 1 wetlands, the minimum distance from the wetland edge is not less than 75% of the buffer width. So where that is located, where the proposal is located within the buffer sometimes matters. And so we made an allowance here for that within wetland buffers.
Carl, are you willing to take comment as you go along, or do you want me to hold it till the end?
If that's up to you, Chair. If you'd like, we can stop and take questions now, or I can just finish up really quickly here. I've just got a couple more things to go through.
Why don't you go ahead and if you have a question, go ahead and ask it now. If it starts feeling scrambled, then maybe we'll change.
Okay.
Go ahead, Tom.
I'm trying to find the 6.2.5.13.
Mm-hmm.
The wetlands permitted uses in buffer areas. I think there's a problem there. And the problem is with the wording of the existing SMP, because it says that basically trails and tables and things can be located in that area if no other location is feasible. Now, feasible has about 20 different synonyms, doable, possible, et cetera, et cetera. I could see someone objecting to placing public art in those wetland areas because there are other feasible or possible locations on the park land. You see did I make that clear?
You're saying that that we may not be able to cite a piece of public art as close to the shoreline as we'd like, because there might be other places in the park that it could be placed.
Someone could certainly take that position and say it's feasible to put this piece of art somewhere else on the property.
Yeah. Provided that no other location is feasible.
Well, I don't know that that's what it says. That no other location is feasible. Well, you know,
Get any more, then I realized the caps were on. So I had to come down here. I've got it on the phone.
I think we've got somebody unmuted there. Yeah, no, I see where you're going with this, Commissioner Brown. I think it's a really good point. Kim, do you have any thoughts on that? I don't know if we picked up on that or not when we were looking at this.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Commissioner, for bringing that up. I think that this is something that caught my eye as well. But I think that with, given the definition of public art and the fact that we were sure to include cultural significance to some degree in the definition of the term, that we felt that there would be a strong enough case to be able to speak to feasibility being related in some way to the significance of the piece and how well it's able to portray its message and communicate the educational component of the piece as being a fundamental feasible consideration in its citing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Kim. And I think actually I do remember, I think we did touch on this kind of briefly too. And that, that's the thing about art, isn't it? Is that in some cases where the art is cited is as important as the piece of art itself. And I think that's especially true when we're talking about these pieces that are relative to historical or cultural significance, that where they're located has meaning. And so I suppose, Commissioner Brown, to your point, when we're talking about feasibility, I guess we'd have to look at it as a feasibility analysis in some ways. And I think that cultural and historical significance would have to be a factor within that feasibility analysis.
I think so, Carl. Oh, sorry.
Is that?
No, I was just gonna say, I think that you're right. I think that it would come to a point of considering, at least in this context, that feasible needs to consider significance from a historical, educational, cultural perspective. I think that this plays in. We've yet to get to this point of your presentation, Carl, but when you start discussing section 7.22 and we introduce the requirement to involve the Arts Commission, then I think that it creates a bit of an opportunity to publicly involve and create a process for an understanding of that cultural feasibility.
Yeah.
What the words say is, provided that no other location of such facilities no other location is feasible. And I don't think that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to be flexible and place the art where it belongs without regard to whether or not there's another location which it could be placed on. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I really think.
Sorry.
I think you need an amendment to paragraph 1 there to eliminate that provided no other location is feasible language, because I think that's going to cause problems down the road.
I think that's a really good point, Commissioner Brown. I'm making a note of that to take a look at. But I think that's a really good point. And I think Kim and I are we're talking through it as we're talking to you in a sense. But I think we definitely need to look at that maybe a little bit more carefully. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I my feeling, Tom, and I think you bring up a good point. because the wording is going to get parsed, no doubt, as I'm sure it has in the past, it will in the future. But for me, that statement allows a safety check, as it were, to ensure that these things that are especially placed in a critical area are scrutinized very carefully, and any applicant is forced to provide a very sound, direct, and cogent argument that the other places are not feasible for the following reasons, A, B, C, D. And without that language, I think it's too broad and too permissive.
Well, I guess my point is, I'll just make this statement and then let it go. It's not a question of how many places are feasible. It's a question of whether art belongs at a certain specific location. Now, permeable trails and fire pits and viewing platforms, they're easy to test. Do we have to invade the wetlands with this viewing platform, or would it be feasible to put it someplace else on the property, right? That's not the issue with art, and that's my simple point.
I'd like to add something about this. When I hear these words, I think feasibility and artistic suitability. I'm trying to find the right buzzword for it, but art comes into a different realm sometimes. And I think, Carl, you made a great statement saying sometimes the setting of artwork, public artwork, is as important as the artwork itself. So maybe there's a caveat or some different words that would put a little different twist on pieces of artwork. Because Tom's right, you could put a piece of artwork any place on the parkland, and you could, but then the artist would probably, say that's not really what I had any intention of. If you put it in the back corner of the lot, they want it to be near the water, and it conveys some specifically important concept that goes along with the artwork. So something suitable for the artistic expression. Just a thought.
I really like the artistic suitability. That's a I have to think about that phrase, but that would something like that. I mean, obviously we have to vet this a little bit more and maybe study it a little bit more, but and it has to be something, I suppose, specific to public art in that sense. But I don't know if it's another word that replaces feasible, or if it's another phrase that goes along with feasibility that speaks directly to public art, like Commissioner Soltis just suggested. But that might be that might be a path forward.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can see the issue with the wording of feasible, but wouldn't that issue of feasibility regarding placement that has significant value be discussed within the proposal? That would allow a submitter to say that particular areas are the only areas feasible to meet the needed intent of the artwork.
Yeah, I think that's true, Commissioner Bradbury. I think in the and I think Kim touched on this too. In the proposal, whatever group is proposing this, whether it be the city or a tribe or a nonprofit group out there, or just an interested citizens group or something, they would be bringing this, and I should just scroll down then. They would be bringing this up through the Arts Commission, and not only the Arts Commission, but the City Parks Commission would also have some say in where this would be located. And so there would be some of this, I suppose, feasibility analysis done through those processes. And so I suppose the applicant at that point would have to make their argument for why there is no other feasible alternative for citing that piece of art. I think Commissioner Brown's point is that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Commissioner Brown, but I think what you're saying is that this could be something that if we overlook now, or if we don't deal with now, could be, could shoot down a lot of potentially good proposals in the future. I think is, or just maybe I shouldn't say good proposals, maybe I should just say proposals in the future.
Yes, that is one of the concerns.
Hey, Carl, can I add to your point?
Of course.
Chair, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
I only wanted to add, and again, Carl is yet to dive into this portion of his presentation, but he's about to discuss the requirement for these projects to achieve no net loss of ecological function. And so even in many other development opportunities in the city, we have instances completely unrelated to public work. I mean, present day development proposals where an applicant will make a case that the development is necessary to encroach upon a certain critical area buffer, wetland buffer, vegetative conservation strip, and that no other location is feasible for X, Y, and Z. And they make that statement. And if their justification is what it is, and there is no other feasible location, then the requirement comes that they are having, they may be having an encroachment or an impact on a critical area that has to be mitigated for, because the site is responsible for achieving no net loss of ecological function. And so we were careful to require that same no net loss of ecological function for public art installment as well.
Okay, thanks for that point. And I think what we ought to do, Carl, is since Kim's finding herself having to jump forward, let's let you finish your presentation and people can jot down their questions and we'll ask them all at the end.
Okay, sounds good, Chair. Thank you. Okay, then, so moving on, back to the two keys to this thing, and in bringing this into the SMP, we have to define the use. We have to create the use, first of all, and then we have to regulate the use. So this table, this is just an excerpt from this table, 7.11, where we've placed public art, and you'll see it has a section 7.22 and a footer that number 7, which states that public art would only be permissible on city-owned parcels, which is what we discussed. So it's only meant to be on city-owned parcels within the shoreline jurisdictions. And you'll note that in the Public Works proposal, they did something very similar to this as well, but they had made it a conditional use in the low intensity environment. And we spoke with Greddy and Associates about that. And we actually asked Public Works if there was any reason why they had made that a conditional use and not just an outright permitted use in the low intensity environment. And they said that there really wasn't, as Public Works said that there really wasn't necessarily any reason for that. And we checked in with Greddy to find out if there would be any reason why we should do that, based on how the low intensity environment is meant to be administered. And they said that there wasn't really anything that they could see that made any sense to make it a conditional use in any of the 4 environmental designations that we've permitted it in here. And then of course it's not permitted outright in the natural environment and the marine deep water environment.
Carl, what is the low intensity? What is that describing?
That's a shoreline environmental designation. I don't have so these are all shoreline environmental designations within our shoreline master program.
Mhm.
Uh,
So
and-
what kind of environment is a low intensity environment?
Let me see if this map has that on it or not. One sec here. So yeah, this map does have it. So you can see here that this orangish area, those are our low intensity environmental designations, mostly along the other shore. And so a lot of single family residential, mostly. And Kim, correct me if I'm wrong, because you know the shoreline better than I do, but it's mostly single family residential and that's mostly true down in this neck of the woods as well, obviously, except for right up in here, we've got a little bit of commercial development going on across from the park, but I think it's mostly single family. Actually, the city waterfront probably contains most of that commercial up in that area too, I think, but am I getting that right, Kim?
I wouldn't add anything to what you just said, Carl. There's a, nominal amount of water-oriented commercial development, but it is largely single-family residential. You can see at kind of just outside of the mouth of Crescent Creek right there. Thank you. Yeah, right. Exactly where your mouse is. There's a small amount of what may include a little bit of commercial development, but otherwise largely single-family residential.
Does that answer your question, Commissioner Bennett?
That does. Thank you.
Let me get back here. Whoop. It's not letting me. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Okay, and then finally we get into the new section, public art, 7.22, and what we've tried to do here essentially is, instead of inserting public art into another section like recreation or something like that within the SMP, really kind of giving it a life of its own, and then we can also affect it directly through regulation and policy, and that seemed to make the most sense. And Gretty and Associates really agreed with us on that as well. That was their recommendation right out of the chute as well. So with this, you get sort of a statement, what the goal statement for what public art is in the city. And then you get into policies, visual obstruction, obviously something that's of concern to everyone along the shoreline. We talk about vegetation or any new structures going up, and that's something that we value highly in Gig Harbor, and we talk a lot about. Location, of course, give preference to public art located on or near the shoreline, to facilitate the public's ability to reach and enjoy the water's edge. And that's something that sort of permeates the shoreline master program is, while we're trying to protect the shoreline, we're also trying to get people to the shoreline. In a lot of our commercial projects, we, in some cases, unless it's unfeasible for them to do so, we require them to create some sort of access down to the shoreline. So we're trying to get people down there, but we also want to protect it at the same time. And so we're seeing public art then as an opportunity really to create a place. It's placemaking, classic planning, getting people to a location that they might not otherwise enjoy. No net loss. Kim just touched on that a minute ago. That's against a thread that permeates the shoreline master program. And so nothing that would ever be allowed within the area that we're talking about, and that's within these buffers and the VCS, would be allowed to have a net loss of ecological function on the site. Materials. This is interesting, and this kind of comes back to our design manual just a little bit, in that when we have some regulations in our design manual for benches and tables that are being publicly used, say in a common area or something, and they have to be made of certain material that's durable and that's going to last, so that we don't end up with just crummy looking, kind of craft furniture that just falls apart or gets blown into the right of way or creates a nuisance in some manner and just isn't maintained for the long haul. So So that was included here as we're building something in the public space. Coordination. So this gets into who's going to be involved in citing this thing. Coordinate proposals for the installation of public art with affected property owners. In this case, would almost always be the city, and with the City of Gig Harbor Arts Commission to ensure it is consistent with the goals of this section and overall goals of this program. And we could go one step further and say that the Arts Commission is very interested right now in having, they've actually have an application in to have an element, their own element, an public arts element in the comprehensive plan. So there's a lot of movement right now in the city in support of arts. And so I think that this amendment kind of comes at a really good time for the city to be thinking about this. I think there's a lot of synergy right now. So having the Arts Commission, I think, in this gives sort of another layer of protection, really, to the shoreline and to the public space to ensure that this is getting a lot of eyes on it. It is being heavily scrutinized before we even get to a permitting stage. Consistency with other plans. I just kind of touched on that. Comprehensive plan, our Parks and Recreation open space plan. Public Works had put together a narrative that included some support from those plans to support their proposal. We kind of went another step further and poured through the comprehensive plan and the pros plan and pulled out some more stuff. And we'll be including that. A lot of that analysis will really show up in the staff report when we get to the public hearing stage. Okay, and then 722.2 are the regulations. And these regulations are really meant to be, and Kim, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to overstep a little bit here, but these regulations are meant to be consistent with how we are regulating other things within the shoreline jurisdiction. So we're not trying to get out on a limb too much, even though we are allowing something within the BCS that we haven't traditionally allowed in the past. We're still trying to say, okay, look, we are allowing some encroachment into the BCS in certain instances, and here's how we're regulating those things. So now extrapolating from that and pulling out those elements of these other things that we've allowed in the past and applying them to this new use, that's really where these regulations are coming from. Kim, if I'm wrong on that and any of those points, please feel free to jump in and correct.
No, I think you're on all fronts right, other than perhaps the 200 square foot or 1% of the lot size for maximum impervious coverage that we discussed right there at the top, and that was based off of conversations, among staff, with the applicant, with Grady, and of course with this commission as well. And so that's kind of the one newbie, I guess you could call it. But yeah, everything else was intended. There was no hope or intent of needing to reinvent the wheel for the regulations that apply here.
Yeah, and that's an important point, Kim. Thanks for bringing that up. So the 200 square feet or 1% of the lot size. We try to think about what is reasonable for an art installation, and you could say what is reasonable for any sort of use that you might see along a shoreline, I suppose, barring a single family home, but those are going to be set back pretty far. So anything that's really encroaching that far down and that close to ordinary high water mark, 200 square feet seems reasonable. And we're not saying that it's going to be a 200 square foot structure or piece of art. That 200 square feet really encapsulates the use itself. So you may have a piece of art in the center with a small pathway around it. Maybe there's a seat for enjoying it. or a little kiosk that explains what it is. But, so we have to kind of think about the whole thing. And also keep in mind that this says that it'd be limited to a maximum impervious lot coverage of 200 square feet. So we are talking about the entire lot as well. So it's not just, it's not going to be 200 square feet next to 200 square feet next to 200 square feet, in other words. And I think that's the end of the regulations. That's the end of the staff recommendation. And I think I'll leave it there, Chair. I think that's enough for us to really kind of dive into this. And as I said, I have the full chapters loaded up with these amendments in them. If anybody wants me to pull those up for a little more context or anything like that, I can do so.
Okay, thanks. That's a nice presentation. I think you guys did an awesome job of pulling together the discussion that we had 2 weeks ago. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And with that, I will open it up to the floor for questions, comments, wise or otherwise.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
first of all, I really like the new definition of public art. I think that's an improvement over the old one. So I want to express my support for that. Second is a question for Carl, and that is, what about art that's on private land? How is that dealt with? So suppose I had a backyard facing the harbor, and I wanted to put up a big statue or some kind of art display there. How is that dealt with?
Well, we would deal with it as we would deal with, so we could deal with it. There would be a few different ways that could be dealt with. So we do have some allowances in our code for what we call normal yard appurtenances, which can be a little vague. We have a few things defined in there, but not everything. And so here, back to that sort of feasibility discussion we had a minute ago, where you can kind of really run down a rabbit hole. But we would deal. The short answer to that is we would deal with it just with our regular zoning code. So it would either be something that might be outright allowed and not permitted, depending on what it is, depending on how tall it is, depending on the size and the lot coverage that it would take up. We would likely look at it as a structure, in some manner. But yeah, we don't really have a definition necessarily of backyard art. Now, like I said, we do have this normal yard appurtenances, and I think in some cases, some of those things would likely fall under that.
Okay, thanks, Carl.
Would that still be the same case, going back to John's situation that he gave, even if you were a waterfront property and wanted to put a statue right there in the shoreline on your waterfront property? Or would that just fall under all of the same thing that we're reading here now as part of the new regulations?
Well, this regulation that we're working on now is relative only to public property. So
okay.
This is only going to be for public property and not private property. And so private property is a whole other animal.
Okay.
So we're making an allowance for public properties for public enjoyment. So the public still benefits from it, but we're not creating a benefit necessarily for private property with this amendment.
I have one more quick question, and that was just related to the last section in these 7.22.2 regulations with the maximum impervious lot coverage. When you say 1% of the lot size, is that a parcel? is a lot the same thing as a parcel, or what makes a lot when you're talking, especially a public piece of property?
Kim, you want to take that?
Sure. Sometimes lots and parcels are distinguished based on actually Carl is so much better suited to address this. He's better explaining it, but sometimes lots and parcels are distinct in their taxation. But yeah, in large, when we're talking about lot coverage, we're talking about the land that is specific to the parcel or the lot.
Okay, thank you.
So that I'm sorry, Kim. I should have gone ahead and answered that. I didn't mean to. I was
You're
thinking
better at it, Carl.
I was thinking Commissioner Bennett was asking a different question, and then I got it as I handed it over to you. But a lot, I'm reading from our definitions in Title 17 right now. A lot means an area of land that is described by meets and bounds or recorded plat and is to be used, developed, or built upon as a single unit of land. And so that's kind of the basis for a piece of land would be a lot. Now you have parcels. A lot of people use parcel and lot interchangeably, and really we shouldn't, because lots are really buildable, and a parcel is really something that has a parcel ID number. So you can have parcel upon parcel upon parcel. You can have one lot divided up with a whole bunch of parcels, but not necessarily have a whole bunch of lots that could be buildable. So it's a weird kind of nuance, and it really gets lost a lot. It's something that we have to be careful of as planners, because we, especially with boundary line adjustments and things like that. But using lot in this instance is the right vernacular for sure.
And so for like the applicant that is out currently, would you consider the whole park to be the lot then? Or would there be multiple lots within that? Basically the whole park would be the lot. So it would be the 1% or the 200 square feet, whichever one is smaller for the entire park itself.
That's how we were thinking about it, Commissioner
Okay. Bennett.
Yeah. And, I guess, and I thought about that too, that when you put it in terms like that, and if we have a really large park, it could be a little limiting, I suppose, in some ways. But we're also, in some cases, the whole park isn't going to be necessarily, should I say, encumbered by those buffers. And so there might be other areas where you could put art, but don't necessarily need to, aren't necessarily utilizing these regulations in the same way. Is that right, Kim? Am I stating that properly?
Right. One of the things that was discussed 2 weeks ago by this commission was that we wanted to just be mindful of and take care to the concern that there might be this proliferation of public art that's installed, and that we wanted to be careful to avoid that kind of circumstance. And so this was our crafty solution, recognizing the sensitivity around how you could define a single piece of art. Could multiple, something that one person considers to be multiple pieces of art might be considered just one piece. And so instead, it just seemed to make more sense to us to limit the lot coverage instead. Call it however many number of pieces of art that you'd like. You're limited to this much lot coverage.
So to follow that, Austin Estuary Park is where we're talking about the current proposal, correct? That's
correct. Of course, these changes are not specific to that.
Right. I understand that, but that's I think that is separate and distinct from Donkey Creek, correct?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
So that's actually a very small park, unless unless I don't understand the limits of it. The Harbor History Museum, is that a city property or is that a 501c3 organization that sits on city property or?
That property, that's a great question. We have an easement for stormwater and a stormwater outfall that runs underneath the museums. That's immediately what I think of. That it's all part of a binding site plan, so they are all interconnected. There's 3 parcels there that are connected: the park, the Harbor History Museum, and then the little office building there.
Right.
Behind but not the gas station, and not the little restaurant is also not part of that. Brett Marlowe's site, I believe, is part of that binding site plan. So they are all related, those properties. But when this talks about a lot, it would just be that one singular lot that this amendment would apply to.
Right. And the point of that I'm driving at is that's a pretty small piece of property. So the 1% rule would limit significantly on a small park like that, or at Ansich Park, for example, whereas Zamel Park is huge. Anyway, I'm trying to understand it with regard to the restrictions and limitations.
So I think this is the park right here that I'm going around, but I think part of that is also in the tideland. So yeah, I think, I think that's a really good point. And, and when you look at Donkey Creek is actually made up of 3 lots. So that might, I don't know, is that something we want to consider?
Carl, why did you guys? Sorry.
I'm sorry, Commissioner. Carl, I think that I can offer the chair a little bit more of a pointed kind of direct specific to Austin Estuary Park on the sizability, if you think it'd be helpful.
Sure.
You're muted, Carl. What do you think?
Could you say that again? I couldn't hear you very well.
I think that I can give a more, direct pointed response to the size of Austin Estuary and how we would review the size of allowed public art to address the chair's question, if you think it'd be helpful.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Kim.
Okay, yeah. So the size of the lot at Austin Estuary Park is 1.38 acres. And so 1% of that would be equivalent to about 600 square feet. And so in the case of this site, they would be limited to the 200 square feet because, of course, that's the lesser of the 2 sizes. So
Okay.
you can see in comparison, I think you're right that Austin Estuary Park is not a very large park. But even as small as it is, it still would not be able to make use of the 1% because that 200 square feet, as we have it presently drafted, that 200
Sure.
square feet would be the lesser of the 2.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that because that gives me a great frame of reference to say that even in what may be our smallest city park, with the current language as you're proposing, this would still be potentially allowed. So thanks.
Sure.
So I guess I'm thinking, why are we even trying to put percentages on here when 200 square feet sounds like a good number for any statute in any size park? I'm not quite sure I understand the nuance of trying to, because we just had the example, even in our very small park, the 200 square foot requirement sticks. So why don't we just have a square foot one and avoid all the percentage back and forth? What are we gaining by it, I guess is my question. And I'm probably missing something, but.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. But I think we also have to consider the future and the possibility that we end up with another park or more parks that this could apply to. I mean, right now we're looking at what we have. But I suppose there's potential that we end up creating a new park, and maybe one, that's even smaller, and 200 square feet would maybe seem massive to that small park in that case. And so then, the 1% rule might save us from taking up an entire park with an art project. Now, of course, this is all again vetted through the Arts Commission, and Parks Commission is going to be involved in that, and so the likelihood of something like that happening is probably not great, anyway. But I think personally, from staff's perspective, I think it makes sense to have, and this is kind of typical code language, to have one, an area or a percentage, whichever is less. That's fairly typical code language that we see even throughout our own code, and you see it in a lot of other codes. So I think from our perspective it makes sense to have that, but certainly I think it's certainly worth discussing.
Chair, I have another couple questions, if I may.
Sure.
Carl, I was looking at 200 square feet versus 15% clearing versus in 7.22, 1% of the lot. The 15% clearing, that's just a number that is done prior to, during the installation. Is that correct?
15% is in, let me scroll up here and just get to it.
BCS.
For the BCS. So the 15% clearing is an allowance and so I knew we were going to get to this point. Let me get over to the actual chapter to show you where that comes from. So that comes from this section here, and I'll scroll up to get the title. So this is our regulations for vegetation conservation strip. And we're adding a new section to this, section 9, but it's referencing this section, section 4. And Kim, you're probably going to be better suited to answer this question. But this is where that percentage comes from, and essentially no more. So the following applies to minimally disturbed areas containing existing native plant communities located within the marine vegetation conservation strip or critical area buffer. And it essentially is making an allowance for no more than 15% the area within the native shoreline vegetation to be cleared. And so we've kind of carried that on into this regulation for public art, again, to maintain consistency. And Kim, if you want to add anything to what I'm saying there, please do jump in, but that's where that number comes from.
Yeah, Carl, it might actually be more helpful if you go down another couple of pages. Again, this is another example, Commissioner, of an opportunity that staff took to avoid recreating the wheel. And so if you just keep on going down a little bit more, I think, Carl, I think it's, what is it? I'm losing my touch. Is it F? Is it G? Keep going. Or
Further.
Maybe not. Maybe I'm steering you the wrong way. Let me open it myself. Because the reference and where we added this, let's see.
The way that I read this, as you look, Kim, is that you guys used that no more than 15% could be disturbed during the installation of the project, and the expectation is that it would be revegetated with native plants once the installation was done.
That's not necessarily the case, Chair. And I can explain better. Carl, the page you're looking for is 6-26.
Oh, it is?
Yep. So there are very few, very limited instances in our SMP that allow for a critical area buffer or a vegetative conservation strip. Again, these being regulated separate of a wetland buffer for these areas to be, thank you, Carl, right here, exactly. There are limited instances for a critical area buffer or for a vegetative conservation strip to be to have any sort of allowed activity or development within that area. And in those limited circumstances that we already have set forth as legislative language in our SMP, it is limited to that size, to that 15% clearing, and the clearing might very well be a pathway. Carl kind of referenced that earlier. It might very well be a pathway that goes through the VCS to be able to perpetuate and allow for and encourage the public's enjoyment of the water. And so that area might be cleared to that extent, but doesn't need to be revegetated, which is why I framed my question to you the way that I did, Chair, that it doesn't necessarily need to be revegetated with native vegetation within that 15% area. The rest of the VCS does have its own separate requirements for how much vegetation needs to be provided, and it does have to be native. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, I asked Carl to go to this page because you can specifically see the section that immediately precedes what we wrote, which gives more reference to kind of those limitations and percentages.
Yeah, and the nuance, of course, is the difference between the VCS as far as the 15% goes and the entire lot, which is where the 200 or 1% comes from. So there's a definite distinction there.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Sorry, can I make a quick comment?
Sure.
Two things. I mean, I really appreciate everything that you incorporated into your draft on this based on the things we talked about before. I think you guys have done a great job with that. And the one part that I was having a problem with was the high water mark. And I don't remember what section that was, 7.22. Where you talk about the permitting and that there it is. Wait, where'd it go? Just that it shouldn't be wayward of the high water mark, and I appreciate that that was included because I think that's a really important consideration. My question is, it refers to that the art shouldn't be placed there. Is there any part that needs to say that the access also can't be wayward of the ordinary high water mark?
That's a good question, Commissioner Grenett. So we'd have to go, let me thinking about that then. Public art is defined in this version anyway as original works of visual art that have been created with the specific intent to be displayed in public spaces for community enjoyment and education. These include but are not limited to sculptures, statues, interpretive displays, murals, and memorials intended to reflect the city's historical and or cultural significance to the community.
And the reason I asked the question is I went back to the proposal that was submitted, and in that they showed the art and they showed, kind of a walkway access area around it. And that's the reason why I'm asking this question. I just want to make sure that we don't open up a loophole.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And we don't, I was going back to the definition because I wanted to see, I couldn't remember if we had defined sort of appurtenances of the installation as part of that definition, so that, it's not just the piece of art, it's the, the whole installation that comes along with it. Could be the kiosks or the chairs or the pathways. And I think that's something that we talked about, Kim, you and I, when we were thinking about this too, is the pathway you know, in the case of this honoring project, they've got a pathway that sort of circles the piece of art and might be getting a little bit below, you know, closer to ordinary high than we would otherwise allow, and maybe couldn't even allow even through these regulations potentially. And so I think that's really that is sort of the answer, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Kim. But my answer to that question would be that we are allowing something within the VCS, but all pieces, all parts of that allowance have to conform and comply with these regulations. And those pieces and parts that are not necessarily outright defined as public art within these regulations would not be allowed any closer to ordinary high either, and in fact could be looked at as something other than public art and might fall under a different regulation. I'm thinking about pervious trails or something like that in that sense. I think that's kind of what we discussed, Kim, when we were thinking about this. Am I right?
Well, specific to the project at Austin estuary, what it very well may come down to is permitting outside of our agency that involves terminology and datum that we do not regulate against. And I'm thinking specifically of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. You may remember that a few months ago, I came to this commission and gave a presentation on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for Section 404 permitting and the changes that they'd made to how they define the high tide line. You can't have any fill or dredge activity waterward of the high tide line without securing a Section 404 permit from the Corps of Engineers. And that high tide line may very well be further landward than what is indicated as the ordinary high water mark on this site. That's yet to be determined, but it may be, it may create complications for the applicant from the Corps' perspective that eventually influence the applicant to change the location of their proposed public art so that it's more landward than where it presently is, just to simply be able to avoid the permitting through the Corps.
Thank you, Kim. It was that conversation that made me ask that question. So I'm referring back to your presentation a couple months ago. Thank you.
Of course.
Other questions? I have a couple if nobody else has any at this moment. The materials, I would be concerned about any materials, and is this the appropriate place, or is it covered someplace else to, like, for an applicant to give a comprehensive list of any material that's going to be used in a piece of artwork to ensure that there's no possible way to contaminate the land or the water with the natural erosion of a piece of art?
Chair, that's a really good question. I think that would get back to and would get into the no net loss discussion, and likely also then when we got into a mitigation discussion. So, you know, if somebody came in and wanted to place a creosote laden pile, you know, along the shoreline and call it art, I suppose. Well, that would obviously create a net loss of ecological function and just would not be, wouldn't be allowed. So that's where my mind goes when I think about that question that you're asking. I don't think that we have, other than with docks and floats and things, we have some requirements for for grading and what those materials can be. Again, and Kim, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that a lot of that would be vetted through the agencies as well.
Right, yeah, like for your creosote example, ecology would never, I think that they now expressly prohibit creosote pile. And pile is another example in our SMP, Carl, where we specifically call out steel or concrete pile as being permitted materials. But of course, I can imagine art being constructed of many other materials, to your point, Chair, that maybe aren't presently discussed in our SMP that we should be considering. I agree that with Carl's address of it, and that if there were anything that were to be damning in any way ecologically, that it would be managed through the no net loss process.
Sure. Yeah, I would just be comfortable with if it was explicit somewhere. I mean, for example, what is going to be in this piece of artwork that kicked off this whole discussion? What's it made of? I read the application and I don't recall any indication in there of what the actual construction materials are going to be.
It's a carving of wood. This is stuff as much as I know. I don't know what kind of wood though.
Yeah. Okay. And then do these these pieces of artwork, do they become the city's property and the city becomes responsible for the upkeep and management of them, or how does that work?
As I understand it, that is how it does work. They become part and parcel of the city's responsibility. Now, there may be, I suppose there could be cases where maybe something is consigned to the city or loaned or something like that, but I don't know of any cases like that to date. I think that most of the pieces of art that are within the inventory that's managed by the city now, I believe that they're owned by the city. So that's, to my knowledge, that's how it works. And again, that would be, that comes back to E in 722 of coordination with Gig Harbor Arts Commission, and even prior to that, the Parks Commission would be involved in allowing that piece of art to be sited within one of those parks, or at least would be vetted through them in some manner.
Okay. And I think that brings up the point that I don't know if it was Port Townsend you said that you got one of the examples from, but that they specifically prohibited murals. And so I think it's interesting that probably the most perishable piece of public art that you could put up would be a painted mural, because it's going to require, especially in the harsh marine waterfront environment, it's going to require refreshment, as often as you paint your house, which around here is every 7 or 8 years. So in addition to the fact that, so anyway, I would certainly be in favor of considering that restriction in Gig Harbor as well. And I would be interested in hearing from the other commissioners of how they feel about that. But another little town like us thought that was a good idea, and I think they're on to something.
And some of that restriction also could come from, because they do point to their sign code, and that's something that we deal with, and sometimes as well, when a business wants to put a mural on the side of their building, and if it's an advertisement for that business or for a business, then it becomes a sign. And if it's not an advertisement for a business, if it has some, you could take the Finholm mural on the store down there as an example of something that sort of blurs that line just a bit, but that mural also has historical significance in that it is displaying what the district used to look like, or that it has that significance as being Finholmes, and that store happens to be named Finholm. But I think that's likely a reason why Port Townsend has murals found in their sign code rather than allowing it within public art. And I can't remember. Let me go back to that definition. Murals and structures are excluded from this definition. Yeah. It's an interesting point.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to take off now because I have another engagement this evening. So it's been a very interesting discussion, and thank you and good night.
All right. See you, John.
I have a question, Carl. If the amendment to the SMP is approved as written, or more or less as written, is there any reason to think that the art project in question, the one that's been going on for several years, wouldn't be approved in that site where the applicants have requested that it be?
Is there any reason to assume that it would not be approved? Was that the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the question.
It would, well, it still has to go through, get through the permitting process. So it still has to go through the shoreline substantial development permit process. So of course, there's never any guarantee, with a permit. We couldn't say one way or the other. These regulations would give it the opportunity to go through that process.
Carl, in your professional opinion, how long might it take before they are permitted and can begin the installation?
I honestly, I couldn't say, because especially with shoreline permits, there's a lot of process that you have to go through.
Yeah, okay.
And so, I wouldn't want to say and then mislead you, or if it ends up getting kind of sideways. So
Okay. One other question. Attachment 5 to your documents for tonight had to do with the comp plan and quotations from the comp plan. And I take it that all of those quotations, goals, whatever, are in the current comp plan. And I guess my question is, do you see the need for any changes to the comp plan to permit public art installations as we have been discussing?
I don't, because I think that the support that we have, especially in the harbor element, is pretty strong. That's my take on it. And I think that the comp plan and support for an amendment like this in the Shoreline Master Program only gets stronger when the comprehensive plan, when and if the comprehensive plan is adopted with an arts and culture element of its own. So I think that's the big amendment that really needs to happen for Gig Harbor to support more art and projects of historical and cultural significance.
Okay. The other question I have is more related to process, and it may not interest other commissioners or members of the staff. Perhaps if you could give me a call tomorrow or early next week, we could discuss the process things, and I could get a better understanding of how things flow and how they work and who does what to whom.
Okay, sounds good, Commissioner Brown.
Thank you.
And actually, Tom, I would ask your question of I can't remember how you phrased it. Is there any reason it wouldn't be approved? I would modify that to say, is there any reason it couldn't be approved? So in other words, we're trying to create a a policy where such a project can be considered, not guaranteed approval. And I, again, as I expressed at our last meeting, I think that we need to be sensitive to the fact that that particular one, in the application that I read, I did not see a compelling argument presented that it had to be pushed so close to the water. So I want to see a process that allows it to be considered, but with the yin and the yang, that there is a very close level of scrutiny applied to anything that would infringe that close to the water. And so I want us to strike that balance.
Mhm.
And then my last question, I think, is do we as the Planning Commission, I'm not seeing a part where we would actually stay involved or be involved in any of this once we write this amendment. And I say that from the perspective of the proliferation of art, and I'm not sure that we're going to see that, but the bottom line is that the Arts Commission is made up of artists for the most part, who have a very unique and usually similar way of looking at life, that doesn't necessarily represent the entire community. And so I would not want them to be the sole gatekeeper of what kind of piece of art or what kind of art gets put in our sensitive waterfront area. And then just a footnote, it's talking about murals. I'm talking about specifically in that same area that we're discussing, because I agree that Finholm's mural is cool. It's awesome. It belongs where it is. I've been to Chemainus up in Victoria, Canada, where there's 30 different building sites that are painted with historical stuff. Cool place to visit. I've been to 3 other towns like that, but I don't think it belongs on the waterfront Gig Harbor.
Chair, I think that's a fair point. And I made a note about that, about considering taking the murals out of the, maybe taking murals out of the definition or some other, and definitely something that could be considered. I don't know, is it something that we want that the commission would like to see stricken from the staff recommendation at this point, or as we move forward, is it something that we would like to consider taking out, or wait until we hear from the public, and when we get to hearing and deliberation, talk about it then?
I'd be in favor of taking it out right now and letting it work its way back into the public process. I share some of the Greg's concerns about long-term maintenance, and I'm having a hard time with a mural in a 200 square foot, even or a 1% property. Murals generally kind of have a longitudinal side to them as opposed to like a statue or a fountain. It seems like almost a different beast to me. So
Yeah, I think it's a good point.
Well, it could be 5 feet tall and 40 feet long, Bob.
you're right.
That brings up a question for me, back to, and maybe we addressed this last time, I can't recall, but back to the coordination section, and to the discussion about the Arts Commission being the gatekeeper for this sort of thing. Where does the Parks Commission come into this? if the Arts Commission ensures consistency with the goals of this section, as that state section states, the Parks Commission are going to be the people whose property, basically, who are in charge of the property that it's on. Where do they come into this in terms of saying, yes, this is appropriate for this park, or no, this is not appropriate for this park? And they're, I'm assuming, the ones who would end up being concerned about being taking care of it over time as well. And that becomes a funding situation in terms of maintenance. Who cleans it up when there's garbage at the base of it or what have you, or something like that. So would we put the Parks Commission into coordination, or is that part of another process that they elsewhere, that they are part of it?
So I think it's a good point, Commissioner Bennett. I thought about that as well. But I think that it's covered through affected property owners, because like you said, the Parks Commission is sort of, they're not necessarily the property owners or on the tax roll. That's the city of Gig Harbor. But I'd have to go into the pros plan and see how it's actually coordinated. But as far as I know, nothing happens within a park without having first gone through the Parks Commission and getting approval from the Parks Commission. So in a sense, they're sort of the de facto property owner.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. Well, great discussion by everybody. And one thing I don't want, Carl, is just for my, although Bob did chime in and I appreciate that, I don't want my sole voice or a minority voice to cause you to make a change. So, that's not my intent. I want us to, hash these things out as a group and make our best recommendation ultimately as a singular recommendation, but with potentially dissenting voices.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Chair. And my recommendation would be that, I think it's certainly a valid concern. And I think we've heard a couple of those. And, maybe it's a good time to talk about process. If we're kind of done hashing out the details of these amendments, maybe we talk about process and next steps a little bit and what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that's good. We are at
6:42.
6:42, and if I recall, there is a requirement at some point that we have to make a motion to continue the meeting, and I can't remember if that was at 90 minutes or 2 hours. But
That's right.
Anyway, so can you do a quick presentation of that process?
Mm-hmm. I can. Oh, we have a hand raised, Commissioner Bradbury.
Yes, Chair, I also am going to need to step away. I have another engagement coming up at 7 o'clock and need some time to get there. So I do apologize for that.
Well, I'll tell you what then, why don't we, Carl, let's wrap this up quickly and then we'll pick that up at the next meeting.
Okay, I'll just be really, really brief if I could, Chair.
Sure.
And so I can take this off, or actually. So just really quickly, I just wanted to talk about the schedule that I'm working through, which is it's very tight, and it's a joint schedule with the Department of Ecology, who has the ultimate review on these amendments to our Shoreline Master Program, and so in order to get through this process and get this amendment done in the timeline that we're trying to get it done in, we're opting for a joint public review with the Department of Ecology. And so they require a 30-day public comment period to happen prior to any public hearing. So right now, I've been working with the Department of Ecology to get this this amendment noticed through the Department of Ecology and up on our own website to start that 30-day comment period clock. And so right now we've got that started for April 6th, which is next Tuesday, to start taking in public feedback on the amendments as they currently sit. Now, the idea here would be to get to the public comment period will end on May 6th. We would have our planning commission hearing that same evening. At least that's how the schedule reads right now. In there somewhere, I have to issue SEPA. We have to issue a threshold determination on SEPA. There's another comment period, and I have to notice the public hearing for planning commission as well. All that really to say, and it doesn't really affect, other than getting to May 6th and holding the hearing on May 6th, the planning commission, that doesn't really affect what we're trying to do. But our hope is getting to the hearing that we get to a recommendation from planning commission on one amendment up to the city council to consider. Right now we have sort of two working proposals out there, and that's what this public comment period people will consider, either of those. And so I guess the real question, and the reason that I bring up the schedule at all, is that if the commission is comfortable with the amendments as they read currently, is there a reason for another study session on these proposals or not? I guess that's one question. And then the second question is, if not comfortable with them and in going to a hearing with these documents as they're presented tonight, would we foresee substantive changes down the road? And if there are substantive changes to what we have, then that means that I need to go back sort of to the drawing board a little bit with this schedule and massage things with ecology. So I'm just kind of throwing out there, I guess at the end of this meeting, I'm just kind of hoping to get a little bit of a heat check from the planning commission on their comfort level with what has been presented going forward. Happy to come back on April 15th with these, with the same proposals, but I didn't hear anything tonight that leads me to need to go forth and do some more studying on the language, bringing back any amendments. It's kind of sounded like we had a pretty good proposal at this point that could be moved forward. And I'll leave it there. I'm sort of rambling on. I'm trying to get to a point that I'm not sure I'm making. I apologize.
Yeah, no, I think I understand. Personally, I'm comfortable with moving forward with this, but what's everyone else think?
I think the feasibility issue needs to be massaged, and I think that could be done fairly easily.
And I think that's one that I wrote down was the feasibility. And this discussion about murals. And I think that both of those, while they are substantive in some way, I think it's something that could probably be handled through deliberation during the hearing and be made a part of the planning commission recommendation that would then go up to city council. In other words, saying we're okay with this language as presented, but we would recommend these minor changes. And then that also gives, because there will be another comment period leading up to that public hearing at the council, and that gives the public another chance to weigh in on those amendments. If that sounds reasonable to everybody.
Yeah, I think that sounds good because that addresses the points that were brought up and also allows it to continue moving forward. So I like that idea.
And so then the next question would be, is that something that you would like staff to bring back to you on April 15th to discuss a little bit more? Would you like us to go and think about both of those issues and kind of bring back some ideas around them?
Would that hold up your release?
No, because we wouldn't be making any changes. We would just be going and looking at those issues and bringing those issues back to you for your consideration and study. It wouldn't have any effect on actually what the public is. We're not changing what the public would be reviewing then. They're still reviewing the same document, making comments on that same document.
Okay.
Well, I guess it would be a pretty straightforward thing to bring it back on the 15th, and it could be a very short meeting. If we like what we see and allows the process to continue moving forward.
The other way we could handle that, of course, is that you could propose those changes now. We could make those changes within those documents and post them for the public. But it doesn't sound like I don't know that we're ready to, especially with the feasibility one. I don't know if we're ready to really pull a trigger on what that actually looks like from just based on the discussion we had.
Yeah, I would agree. So we'll let you guys play with that, and we'll see you on the 15th.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, well, great discussion tonight, folks, and I know it was long, and I do need to have Michelle, maybe you could check for me and see what that regulation is about the meeting length and the requirement for amendment when we go over a certain amount, or excuse me, a motion when we go over a certain amount of time. I'd appreciate that. And otherwise, we will see you all on the 15th, and I appreciate everybody's input. And we've already been through the schedule, so I'm willing to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Seconded.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
I
Anyone opposed, say nay. Motion passes, and the meeting is adjourned at 6:53.
Great job, Carl and Kim.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. This commission gives such great feedback and gives